Blood dripped from Ragnar Lothbrok's hands as he stood among the carnage of what had once been a simple trade dispute. 6 bodies lay scattered across the muddy ground of his farmstead, their lifeless eyes staring at the iron-grey sky above. The morning had begun with words over grain prices. It had ended with steel and screams, as most things did when men dared to challenge the farmer who dreamed of crowns. "You didn't have to kill them all," Thorstein said quietly, watching as ravens began to circle overhead. The warrior's voice held no judgment, merely observation. He had served at Ragnar's side long enough to understand that mercy was a currency his friend spent rarely, if at all. Ragnar wiped his blade clean on the cloak of the nearest corpse, his movements methodical and unhurried. "They threatened what was mine." His voice was soft, almost gentle, the tone a father might use when explaining simple truths to a child. "Every man who does that dies. No exceptions." The dead men had been Earl Haraldsson's tax collectors, come to demand triple the usual tribute. They had brought armed escorts, professional warriors meant to intimidate a simple farmer into compliance. Instead, they had discovered what others had learned before them, that beneath Ragnar Lothbrok's calm exterior lurked something primitive and merciless, a beast that wore a man's skin but killed with a wolf's savagery. "The Earl will hear of this," Thorstein warned, already helping to drag the bodies toward the pit they would need to dig. No proper burial for tax collectors. They would feed the soil they had tried to steal. "Good." Ragnar's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let him hear how 6 of his men fell to a simple farmer. Let him wonder what that farmer might achieve with a proper army at his back." He paused, looking thoughtfully at the blood-soaked ground. "Perhaps it's time we accelerated our plans." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of running feet. Bjorn, Ragnar's 12-year-old son, emerged from the tree line at full sprint. The boy's face was flushed with exertion and excitement. "Father, riders approaching from the south road, at least 20 men under Earl Haraldsson's banner." Ragnar's expression didn't change, but his grip tightened on his axe. "Already? The Earl's reach grows longer." He turned to Thorstein. "Signal the others. If Haraldsson wants blood, we'll give him a sea of it." The next hour was a blur of precise, practiced movements. Warriors emerged from seemingly nowhere, farmers and fishermen by day who had trained in secret under Ragnar's brutal tutelage. They took up pre-arranged positions in the woods and buildings surrounding the farmstead, weapons ready but hidden from view. Lagertha emerged from the longhouse in full battle gear, her shield already strapped to her arm. 15 of ours," she reported crisply, "all armed and in position. Floki's group is moving to cut off their retreat." Ragnar nodded, studying his wife with pride and something darker. She was never more beautiful to him than in moments of impending violence. "Keep Bjorn with you. He's ready for his first blood, but I want you watching his back." "And you?" Her eyes narrowed, reading his expression. "What game are you playing, husband?" "The only game worth playing." He kissed her fiercely, tasting the promise of violence on her lips. "The one where we win everything or die trying." The Earl's men arrived with the arrogant confidence of those who believed their master's authority made them invulnerable. They found Ragnar alone in his courtyard, seemingly unarmed, leaning on a farming hoe as if he had been interrupted at his work. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Sigvard, rode slightly ahead of the others. "Ragnar Lothbrok," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "You stand accused of murdering agents of Earl Haraldsson. Surrender now, and you may yet keep your head." Ragnar's laugh was genuine, if cold. "Murdered? Is that what they're calling justice these days?" He stepped forward, letting the hoe fall to reveal the axe that had been hidden behind it. "Your men came to steal from me through threats of violence. I simply showed them the error of their ways." "Then you admit to the killings?" Sigvard's hand moved to his sword. "Oh, I'll admit to far more than that before this day is done." Ragnar's voice dropped to a near whisper, but somehow it carried to every ear in the sudden silence. "I'll admit that your Earl is a weak man clinging to power he no longer deserves. I'll admit that I've spent years gathering warriors who are loyal to me, not to him. And I'll admit that none of you will leave this place alive unless you swear your swords to my cause." The threat hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then Sigvard's sword cleared its scabbard with a metallic hiss. "Kill this treasonous dog." But Ragnar was already moving, his axe spinning through the air to take Sigvard's sword hand at the wrist. The veteran's scream of pain was drowned out by the thunder of arrows as Ragnar's hidden warriors opened fire from their concealed positions. The Earl's men found themselves caught in a perfectly executed ambush. Arrows rained from every direction, dropping horses and riders alike. Those who survived the initial volley were met by warriors emerging from behind buildings and trees, attacking with the coordinated precision of men who had trained together for years. Ragnar himself was a whirlwind of controlled violence. He ducked under a mounted warrior's swing and hamstrung the horse in a single fluid motion, sending both beast and rider crashing to the ground. His second axe took the fallen man in the face before he could rise. Two more riders charged him from opposite directions, trying to catch him between their horses. Ragnar waited until the last possible moment before diving and rolling, causing the riders to crash into each other. He came up with a fallen spear in hand, driving it through both men before they could disentangle themselves. Across the courtyard, Lagertha proved why she had once been the most feared shield maiden in 3 kingdoms. She moved like a dancer, her shield deflecting blows while her sword found gaps in armor with surgical precision. Beside her, young Bjorn fought with a combination of youthful energy and carefully trained skill, managing to hold his own against a veteran warrior twice his size. The battle was brief but brutal. Earl Haraldsson's men were professional warriors, but they were used to fighting raids and skirmishes. Ragnar's followers fought with the desperate coordination of men who had trained together for years, knowing their lives and futures depended on absolute victory. Within minutes, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Of the 20 riders who had arrived under Haraldsson's banner, only 3 remained standing. They had thrown down their weapons and knelt in surrender, their faces pale with the realization of what they had witnessed. Ragnar approached them slowly, deliberately. Blood dripped from his axes, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man weighing lives in the balance. "You have a choice to make," he told the survivors. "Swear yourselves to me now, join my cause, and live as free men. Or die here as Haraldsson's slaves. Choose quickly. I have graves to dig either way." 2 of the men swore allegiance immediately, their oaths tumbling out in desperate haste. The third, a younger warrior with pride in his bearing, spat at Ragnar's feet. "I'll die before I betray my oath to the Earl." Ragnar's smile was genuine this time. Good. Loyalty should be rewarded. His axe took the man's head in a single clean stroke. Turning to the other survivors, he added, "Remember his courage. That is the kind of loyalty I expect from my own men." As his warriors began the grim work of dealing with the dead, Ragnar walked to where Bjorn stood staring at his first kills. The boy's hands were shaking slightly, his face pale beneath the blood spatter. "You fought well," Ragnar said quietly. "How many?" 2? Bjorn's voice was steady despite his trembling hands. "The first was luck. He fell from his horse, and I got him before he could rise. The second," he swallowed hard. "The second saw me coming. We fought. I killed him." Ragnar gripped his son's shoulder. "Remember this feeling. The gods gave us the capacity for violence, but also the wisdom to know its cost. A ruler must be capable of both." "Is that what you are now?" Bjorn asked. "A ruler?" "Not yet." Ragnar's eyes turned to the horizon, where more ravens had begun to gather. "But after today, everyone will know that we are no longer merely farmers. The Earl moved against us and we bloodied his nose. He'll have to respond with full force now. Anything less would make him look weak. Are we ready for that?" Ragnar's laugh was dark with promise. "Oh yes, I've spent years preparing for this moment. Haraldsson thinks he's forcing my hand, but he's dancing to a tune I began composing long ago." He looked around at his blood-soaked farmstead, at the warriors who had revealed themselves as something far more dangerous than simple farmers. "The time for pretense is over. Now we show the world what we truly are." In the distance, horns began to sound, warning signals spreading the news of battle from settlement to settlement. Soon all of Kattegat would know that Ragnar Lothbrok had defied the Earl openly. There would be no going back now. Floki emerged from the woods like a shadow given form, his eyes wild with battle lust and religious fervor. "The ravens sing your name, Ragnar. They taste the blood you've spilled and cry out for more." "Then we'll feed them well," Ragnar promised, his voice carrying to all his gathered warriors. "This is only the beginning." Everything I've planned, everything we've prepared for starts now. Some will call it rebellion, others will call it treason, but the Skalds will call it destiny." He turned to address his blood-stained followers directly. "Go to your homes. Gather your weapons, your supplies, your families. Return here before nightfall. Anyone who isn't willing to risk everything should run far and fast. I'll think no less of you. But those who stay—" his smile was wolf-sharp in the fading light. "Those who stay will help me carve our names into the very bones of history." The warriors dispersed quickly, moving with the urgency of men who knew time was precious. Soon the Earl would marshal his full forces. Soon the real war would begin. Ragnar stood in his courtyard as the sun began to set, watching ravens feast on the dead. He felt no remorse for the lives he'd taken, no hesitation about the course he'd set. The gods had placed greatness within his reach, and he would grasp it with both hands, no matter the cost in blood. The farmer was dead. The legend was about to begin. And if that legend was to be written in blood and cursed by the gods themselves, well, that was a price Ragnar Lothbrok was more than willing to pay. Night fell over Ragnar's blood-stained farmstead like a funeral shroud, bringing with it not silence but the steady drumbeat of approaching war. Torches flickered in the darkness as warriors returned with their families and supplies, each flame a spark in what would soon become an inferno. The air thrummed with tension, and the metallic tang of spilled blood still lingered, mixing with the smoke of funeral pyres that burned in the distance. Floki moved through the gathering crowd like a serpent through water, his movements fluid and unpredictable. The shipwright's eyes gleamed with an unnatural light as he traced patterns in the air, muttering prayers or curses. With Floki, the two were often indistinguishable. He paused occasionally to study the faces of the gathered warriors, as if reading their fates in the flickering shadows. "The gods are restless tonight," he announced, appearing suddenly at Ragnar's side. "They hunger for more than just the blood you've spilled today. They want a proper sacrifice." Ragnar turned from where he had been studying a crude map of the region, his eyes cold in the torchlight. "Then we'll feed them well. Bring me the prisoner." The surviving tax collector was dragged forward, his once fine clothes now stained with mud and worse. The man had spent the afternoon watching his companions being buried in unmarked graves, knowing his own fate would be far darker. Yet he maintained his dignity, meeting Ragnar's gaze without flinching. "You know what I want," Ragnar said quietly, studying the man as a craftsman might study raw materials. "Tell me the Earl's defensive positions, his patrol routes, the names of those loyal to him only through fear. Do this and you'll live to see another dawn." The tax collector's laugh was bitter. "You think I fear death more than I value my honor? I've served Earl Haraldson since before you were herding sheep, farmer. Do your worst." "Honor?" Ragnar's smile was gentle, almost kind. "No, I think you fear something far more than death. You fear being forgotten." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell me what I want to know, and I'll make sure your name lives in the sagas as the man whose words helped topple a tyrant. Refuse and you'll die nameless in a hole remembered by no one." The prisoner's resolve wavered for just a moment, long enough for Ragnar to press his advantage. "Think carefully. Honor is cold comfort in an unmarked grave." What followed was a symphony of information, each detail a note in the melody of Earl Haraldson's eventual downfall. The tax collector spoke of guard rotations, of secret passages beneath the great hall, of which nobles might be swayed by promises of greater power. He named names, revealed weaknesses, and painted a picture of an earl whose grip on power was far more tenuous than anyone suspected. When the man's knowledge was exhausted, Ragnar nodded to Thorstein. The warrior's blade was quick and merciful, a reward for cooperation. As the body was dragged away, Floki cackled softly. "You promised him remembrance in the sagas," the shipwright observed. "Yet another soul bound to your web of lies." "Not a lie," Ragnar corrected. "When the Skalds sing of my rise, they'll speak of the night a loyal tax collector chose the future over the past. They just won't mention his name." His smile was sharp in the darkness. "The gods appreciate such ironies, don't they?" Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a scout, breathing hard from his run. "Ships approaching from the south," the man reported between gasps. "At least 3 long ships bearing the Earl's colors." Ragnar's response was immediate. "Thorstein, Get the women and children to the cave shelters. Floki, is the ship ready? The shipwright's eyes gleamed with manic pride. She yearns to taste salt and blood, my friend. But the tide. He gestured to the fjord, where moonlight revealed waters too shallow for launching. Then we fight here, Ragnar decided. He raised his voice to address the gathered warriors. The Earl thinks to catch us unprepared, to crush this rebellion before it can truly begin. He expects to find frightened farmers hiding in their homes. His laugh was cold and fierce. Let's show him how farmers fight when they've tasted victory. The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos as Ragnar's forces took up their positions. Years of secret training paid dividends as each warrior knew exactly where to go, what role to play in the deadly game their leader had orchestrated. Archers disappeared into the trees, while shield walls formed in the shadows of buildings. Pitch was spread strategically, ready to be lit at a moment's notice. Lagertha emerged from the longhouse where she had been organizing the evacuation of non-combatants. Her shield was strapped to her arm, and her sword rode easily at her hip. The families are safely away, she reported. And I positioned our best archers to cover their retreat, just in case. Ragnar nodded, studying her face in the moonlight. And Bjorn? Exactly where you'd expect him to be, at the front of the shield wall with Thorstein. Her smile was fierce with maternal pride. He insisted on fighting. Good. Ragnar's voice was distant, his mind already racing ahead to the battle to come. The boy needs to understand what it means to build a kingdom. Sometimes that means fighting in the shield wall like any other warrior. A horn blast cut through the night. The Earl's ships were closing in. Ragnar moved to address his gathered forces one final time. Remember, let them land. Let them think they have surprise on their side. Let them come deep into our trap before we spring it shut. His smile was wolf-sharp in the darkness. Tonight we show Earl Haraldsson that farmers can be more dangerous than berserkers when fighting for their future. The wait was excruciating. Minutes stretched like hours as the sound of oars grew steadily closer. Through gaps in the buildings, Ragnar watched the Earl's ships beach themselves on the shoreline. Warriors spilled onto the sand, forming rough battle lines with the confidence of men who expected little resistance. Ragnar counted under his breath, waiting for the perfect moment. The Earl's forces had advanced halfway up the beach when he gave the signal. Flaming arrows arced through the night sky, igniting the carefully placed pitch. Within seconds, a wall of fire cut off any retreat to the ships. The Earl's men barely had time to register their predicament before Ragnar's forces struck. Arrows rained from the darkness while shield walls emerged from between buildings, turning the beach into a killing ground. The night air filled with screams and the clash of steel on steel. Ragnar himself led the charge from the center, his axes singing their deadly song. He moved with the fluid grace of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of dealing death, each strike calculated for maximum effect. Warriors fell before him like wheat before a scythe, their blood turning the sand dark in the firelight. Through the chaos, he caught glimpses of others fighting their own battles. Lagertha's shield wall held firm against a berserker's charge, her sword finding gaps in the man's guard with surgical precision. Young Bjorn fought alongside Thorstein, the two warriors covering each other with the coordination of men who had trained together for years. The battle reached its crescendo when a group of Earl's men managed to break through the initial wave of defenders. They fought their way toward what they thought was the safety of the farmstead's main building, only to find Floki waiting for them. The shipwright moved like a man possessed, his axes spinning in complex patterns that seemed to defy natural law. His high-pitched laughter carried over the sounds of combat, lending an air of madness to the already chaotic scene. As the fighting began to die down, a horn blast from the south announced the arrival of reinforcements, but not for the Earl. More warriors emerged from the darkness, led by a hulking figure Ragnar recognized as Rollo, his brother. The new arrivals fell upon the Earl's remaining forces with fresh energy, turning what had been merely a defeat into a complete rout. When the last enemy warrior had fallen or fled, Ragnar gathered his lieutenants in the blood-soaked courtyard. The night air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of spilled blood, while ravens circled overhead, drawn by the promise of feast. "Casualties?" he asked, cleaning his axes with methodical precision. 12 dead, 20 wounded, Thorstein reported. "Most will recover enough to fight again." The Earl lost at least 60 men and we captured 3 of his ships. Ragnar nodded, already calculating how to turn this victory into something larger. Burn our dead with honor. The Earl's men can feed the ravens. He turned to his brother. You came. Rollo's smile was fierce in the firelight. Did you think I'd miss this? Besides, better to be on the winning side when the saga begins. He clasped Ragnar's forearm in a warrior's grip. The Earl's power is broken in the outer settlements. Word of tonight's victory will spread. More warriors will come. As if summoned by Rollo's words, a figure emerged from the smoke and shadows. The seer moved with the deliberate grace of one who saw with more than merely eyes, his scarred face hidden beneath his hood. Warriors stepped back to clear his path, many making signs against evil. The ancient mystic stopped before Ragnar, his milky blind eyes somehow finding him unerringly in the chaos. The ravens sing your name, Ragnar Lothbrok. They taste the blood you've spilled and hunger for more. Then let them feast, Ragnar replied, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. There will be plenty more blood before this is done. Oh yes, the seer's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Rivers of it, oceans. I see your path, son of kings. A crown of blood and glory awaits you, bought with betrayal and pain. You will rise higher than any of your line and fall further. His voice grew deeper, resonating with power. The curse comes for you, carried on raven's wings, sealed in serpent's venom. Your name will echo through the ages, but at a price that would make the gods themselves weep. Ragnar felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a cloak of lead. But there was no turning back now. He had killed the Earl's men, burned his ships, and started a war that could end only in total victory or complete destruction. So be it, he whispered, watching the funeral flames paint the sky red. Let the gods weep, let them curse me. I'll build my kingdom on blood and bone, and make them remember my name forever. The ravens circled overhead, their cries a chorus of doom and glory. And in the gathering smoke, Ragnar Lothbrok smiled, already planning his next move in the game of crowns and curses. The farmer was truly dead now, burned away in the fires of ambition and violence. What emerged from those flames would shake the very foundations of the world. Dawn was breaking over the fjord, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. It was, Ragnar thought, a fitting omen for what was to come. The real war was just beginning, and he intended to write its opening chapters in blood. Blood had a way of changing the earth, Ragnar Lothbrok reflected, as he walked the scarred battlefield, where his ambition had first bloomed into violence. 3 days had passed since the slaughter of Earl Haraldsson's forces, and already the ground had begun to drink deep of what they'd spilled. The once frozen soil had turned to mud, dark and rich with possibilities, much like the future he intended to carve from the chaos he'd created. The morning air carried the bite of early spring, heavy with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke from the dozens of cooking fires that now dotted his expanded encampment. What had begun as a farmer's holding had transformed into a war camp, with warriors and their families arriving hourly as word of his victory, spread through the fjords like wildfire through summer grass. Thorstein approached through the morning mist, his boots leaving deep impressions in the bloodied earth. The warrior's face bore fresh scars from the recent battle, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who had chosen the right side of history. The last of the noble houses have declared, he reported, falling into step beside his leader. Half stand with Earl Haraldsson claiming divine right and tradition, the other half— a wolf's smile crossed his face. The other half smell blood in the water and want their share of the feast. Ragnar absorbed this information with the same calculating precision that had served him so well in battle. And the common folk? They remember how you began, a farmer who dared to dream beyond his station. Every freeman with a sword or axe from here to the western settlements talks of joining your banner. Thorstein paused, his expression growing serious. But there's more. The Earl has sent word to King Horik claiming you seek to usurp not just the earldom, but the crown itself. A cold laugh escaped Ragnar's lips. Haraldsson plays a desperate game. The king's forces are tied up with raids along the eastern coast. By the time they can respond, this war will be decided one way or another. His eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of steel and blood. Still, we must move quickly now. Gather the war council. The Earl lost at least 60 men and we captured 3 of his ships. Ragnar nodded, already calculating how to turn this victory into something larger. Burn our dead with honor. The Earl's men can feed the ravens. He turned to his brother. You came. Rollo's smile was fierce in the firelight. Did you think I'd miss this? Besides, better to be on the winning side when the saga begins. He clasped Ragnar's forearm in a warrior's grip. The Earl's power is broken in the outer settlements. Word of tonight's victory will spread. More warriors will come. As if summoned by Rollo's words, a figure emerged from the smoke and shadows. The seer moved with the deliberate grace of one who saw with more than merely eyes, his scarred face hidden beneath his hood. Warriors stepped back to clear his path, many making signs against evil. The ancient mystic stopped before Ragnar, his milky blind eyes somehow finding him unerringly in the chaos. The ravens sing your name, Ragnar Lothbrok. They taste the blood you've spilled and hunger for more. Then let them feast, Ragnar replied, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. There will be plenty more blood before this is done. Oh yes, the seer's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Rivers of it, oceans. I see your path, son of kings. A crown of blood and glory awaits you, bought with betrayal and pain. You will rise higher than any of your line and fall further. His voice grew deeper, resonating with power. The curse comes for you, carried on raven's wings, sealed in serpent's venom. Your name will echo through the ages, but at a price that would make the gods themselves weep. Ragnar felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a cloak of lead. But there was no turning back now. He had killed the Earl's men, burned his ships, and started a war that could end only in total victory or complete destruction. So be it, he whispered, watching the funeral flames paint the sky red. Let the gods weep, let them curse me. I'll build my kingdom on blood and bone, and make them remember my name forever. The ravens circled overhead, their cries a chorus of doom and glory. And in the gathering smoke, Ragnar Lothbrok smiled, already planning his next move in the game of crowns and curses. The farmer was truly dead now, burned away in the fires of ambition and violence. What emerged from those flames would shake the very foundations of the world. Dawn was breaking over the fjord, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. It was, Ragnar thought, a fitting omen for what was to come. The real war was just beginning, and he intended to write its opening chapters in blood. Blood had a way of changing the earth, Ragnar Lothbrok reflected, as he walked the scarred battlefield, where his ambition had first bloomed into violence. 3 days had passed since the slaughter of Earl Haraldsson's forces, and already the ground had begun to drink deep of what they'd spilled. The once frozen soil had turned to mud, dark and rich with possibilities, much like the future he intended to carve from the chaos he'd created. The morning air carried the bite of early spring, heavy with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke from the dozens of cooking fires that now dotted his expanded encampment. What had begun as a farmer's holding had transformed into a war camp, with warriors and their families arriving hourly as word of his victory, spread through the fjords like wildfire through summer grass. Thorstein approached through the morning mist, his boots leaving deep impressions in the bloodied earth. The warrior's face bore fresh scars from the recent battle, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who had chosen the right side of history. The last of the noble houses have declared, he reported, falling into step beside his leader. Half stand with Earl Haraldsson claiming divine right and tradition, the other half— a wolf's smile crossed his face. The other half smell blood in the water and want their share of the feast. Ragnar absorbed this information with the same calculating precision that had served him so well in battle. And the common folk? They remember how you began, a farmer who dared to dream beyond his station. Every freeman with a sword or axe from here to the western settlements talks of joining your banner. Thorstein paused, his expression growing serious. But there's more. The Earl has sent word to King Horik claiming you seek to usurp not just the earldom, but the crown itself. A cold laugh escaped Ragnar's lips. Haraldsson plays a desperate game. The king's forces are tied up with raids along the eastern coast. By the time they can respond, this war will be decided one way or another. His eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of steel and blood. Still, we must move quickly now. Gather the war council. The council convened in what had once been Ragnar's modest feasting hall, now transformed into a command center where maps and weapons competed for space on rough-hewn tables. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and unwashed warriors, mixed with the metallic tang of freshly sharpened steel. Lagertha stood at the head of the main table, her fingers tracing potential routes across a crude map of the region. She had traded her farmer's garb for the full armor of a shield maiden, the steel rings of her byrnie catching the torchlight like scales on a serpent. Beside her, young Bjorn studied the map with an intensity that made Ragnar's chest swell with pride and something darker, a recognition of how quickly blood and violence could age a boy into a man. Rollo leaned against a support post, his massive frame casting long shadows in the flickering light. The warrior's face bore the eager expression of a wolf scenting prey, his fingers drumming restlessly against the axe at his belt. The brothers' relationship had always been complex, built on a foundation of love and rivalry that grew more unstable with each passing day. Floki perched on a bench like some strange bird of prey, his kohl-rimmed eyes darting between the gathered warriors, as if reading their fates in the air around them. The shipwright had been even more manic than usual since the battle, alternating between fits of wild laughter and moments of disturbing lucidity. The Earl's forces are concentrated here, Lagertha indicated a point on the map, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded warriors in past lives. He's fortifying Kattegat's defenses and calling in oaths from his remaining allies. Our scouts report at least 300 warriors within the walls. And how many stand with us? Rollo demanded, pushing off from his post to study the map more closely. 287 warriors capable of bearing arms, Thorstein answered promptly. Another 50 expected to arrive within the week if their ravens speak true. Numbers mean nothing without strategy, Ragnar cut in, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the hall. Haraldsson thinks like a traditional earl. He'll expect us to either lay siege to Kattegat or try to starve him out. So we'll do neither. He moved to the map, his fingers dancing across the carefully drawn lines. While he cowers behind his walls, we'll strike here, here, and here. Each point he indicated represented a settlement or holding loyal to the Earl. We'll bleed him slowly, taking his supporters one by one. Every victory will bring more warriors to our cause. Every defeat will weaken his grip on power. A war of attrition, Rollo mused, a hungry smile spreading across his face. Cut off the limbs before striking at the heart. More than that, Ragnar continued. Each raid serves multiple purposes. We gain resources, deny them to the Earl, and most importantly, his eyes gleamed in the torchlight, so we show everyone in the kingdom what happens to those who stand against us. You mean to make examples, Lagertha stated, her tone carefully neutral. I mean to write our saga in a way that will echo through the ages. Ragnar's voice took on an edge of cold passion. Every victory must be decisive. Every defeat of our enemies must be absolute. When the skalds sing of this war, I want children yet unborn to shiver at the telling. The hall fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. They had all seen Ragnar's capacity for calculated violence, had watched him transform from farmer to warlord with a ruthlessness that both inspired and terrified. But this was something more, a vision of warfare that went beyond mere conquest into the realm of legend-making. The gods will demand a heavy price for such ambition. Floki spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. Already the ravens gather, drawn by the smell of destiny. They know that blood calls to blood, that victory breeds enemies, that every step toward your throne will be paid for in pain. Then let them gather, Ragnar replied, his smile sharp as a blade in winter. Every great saga needs its chorus, and ravens sing as sweetly as any skald. He turned back to the map, his fingers tracing the path of future victories. Now let's plan our first demonstration of what it means to stand against us. The discussion that followed was detailed and brutal, focusing on not just military strategy, but the calculated application of terror. Ragnar had spent years studying not just how to win battles, but how to win wars in ways that would be remembered. Each raid would be choreographed like a performance, designed to send specific messages to different audiences. The first target must be chosen carefully, he explained, circling a particular settlement on the map. Erikstad, held by Sigurd Eriksson, one of Haraldsson's most vocal supporters. More importantly, he's known for his cruelty to thralls and his boasts of being unconquerable in his mountain fortress. A cold smile played across his lips. When we take his head and burn his hall, it will show every noble house that their walls cannot protect them. When we free his thralls and give them weapons to join our cause, it will show the common folk that we fight for more than just power. The approach will be difficult, Thorstein observed, studying the terrain. Those mountains are treacherous and he'll have lookouts posted, which is why we won't approach overland at all. Ragnar turned to Floki. How long would it take to portage 2 ships up the river valley? The shipwright's eyes lit up with manic glee. With enough hands and the right equipment, 2 days, maybe 3. The current runs fast this time of year, perfect for a surprise attack from upstream. They'll never expect ships to appear from that direction. Rollo nodded appreciatively. We could be inside their walls before they know we're coming. Exactly. Ragnar's voice carried the satisfaction of a man seeing long-laid plans coming to fruition. But the attack itself is only part of the performance. We need witnesses to spread the tale, to speak of how Ragnar Lothbrok's ships sailed upriver and fell upon Erikstad like Odin's own fury. He began assigning specific roles, demonstrating the attention to detail that set him apart from mere warriors. Each aspect of the raid was carefully choreographed, from the composition of the attack force to the specific messages that would be sent by their actions. Bjorn will lead the 3rd wave, he announced, causing all heads to turn toward the young warrior. It's time he learned to command men in battle. He's too young, Lagertha protested, maternal concern warring with warrior's pride in her voice. He's old enough to kill, old enough to lead, Ragnar countered. The men need to see that this is more than just my rebellion. It's the beginning of a dynasty. His eyes met his son's across the table. Besides, he has his mother's tactical mind and his father's thirst for glory. A dangerous combination. Bjorn stood straighter under the weight of his father's words, though his voice betrayed youth's eagerness. When do we sail? Tomorrow, with the dawn tide. Ragnar's answer brought murmurs of surprise from the gathered warriors. Speed is our ally now. The longer we wait, the more time Haraldsson has to strengthen his position. His gaze swept the hall, challenging anyone to object. By sunset tomorrow, Erikstad will burn, and our saga will have its first proper chapter. As the council dispersed to begin preparations, Floki lingered behind. The shipwright's usual manic energy had been replaced by something darker, more focused. I had a dream last night, he said softly, his coal-rimmed eyes boring into Ragnar's soul. I saw you standing atop a mountain of corpses, wearing a crown of raven's feathers. The dead sang your name, but their song was a curse as much as a blessing. All great destinies carry a curse, Ragnar replied, his voice equally soft. The gods demand payment for glory. I accepted that price the moment I chose this path. Did you? Floki's laugh held no humor. The price is always higher than we expect, my friend, and it's not always paid by the one who incurs the debt. Before Ragnar could respond, horns sounded from the watchtowers. Moments later, Thorstein burst into the hall, his face grave. Riders approaching from the east, they carry the king's banner. Ragnar's expression didn't change, but something cold and calculating entered his eyes. So, Haraldsson's ravens flew faster than expected. No matter, this too can serve our purpose. He strode toward the door, then paused. Have the riders brought to the great hall, and make sure they get a good look at the battlefield on their way. Let them see what kind of war they're walking into. As he stepped into the brightening day, Ragnar felt the weight of destiny settling more firmly around his shoulders. King Horik's intervention complicated matters, but complications could be turned to advantages by those clever enough to see the possibilities. Already his mind was racing ahead, calculating how to turn this new development into another act in the grand performance he was orchestrating. The ravens circled overhead, their cries a symphony of blood and ambition, and beneath them, Ragnar Lothbrok smiled, knowing that each beat of their wings brought him one step closer to the cursed crown that waited in his future. Destiny carried the scent of wood smoke and iron on the morning King Horik's envoys arrived at Ragnar's war camp. The morning mist clung to the ground like a burial shroud, parting reluctantly before the hooves of their magnificent steeds. Their crimson cloaks, embroidered with the king's raven sigil, seemed to drink in what little light penetrated the gloom, as if nature itself acknowledged the weight of royal authority they carried. Ragnar received them in what had once been his great hall, though it bore little resemblance to its former humble state. Shields lined the walls, their polished surfaces reflecting the dancing light of dozens of torches. Warriors packed the space, their weapons within easy reach, a subtle reminder that while they respected the king's peace, they did not fear it. The principal envoy, a greybeard named Halfdan, whose scarred face spoke of countless battles, carried himself with the easy confidence of one who spoke with a king's voice. His eyes, sharp as a blade's edge, took in every detail of the hall, measuring and assessing with the precision of a merchant weighing gold. Ragnar Lothbrok, Halfdan's voice carried the weight of official proclamation. You stand accused of rebellion against your lawful earl, of murder, of oath-breaking, and of disturbing the king's peace. How do you answer these charges? The hall fell silent, as a grave as all eyes turned to Ragnar. He sat in a chair that deliberately echoed the design of an earl's high seat, his posture relaxed, yet alert, like a wolf choosing whether to attack or simply observe its prey. The torchlight caught the planes of his face, casting shadows that made him appear both younger and more ancient than his years. I answer them with a question of my own. Ragnar's voice was soft, yet it carried to every corner of the hall. When a shepherd proves unable to protect his flock, do the sheep rebel by choosing a stronger protector? Or do they simply follow their nature? He rose with fluid grace, moving to stand before the envoys. Earl Haraldsson's time has passed. He clings to power through fear and tradition, while the world changes around him. I offer something new, a vision of a future where men are measured by their deeds, not their births. Pretty words, Halfdan acknowledged, but words don't change the fact that you've taken up arms against your lawful ruler. The king cannot allow such disorder in his realm. Cannot? Ragnar's laugh held no humor. Tell me, how many ships can King Horik spare from his eastern campaigns? How many warriors can he send to support a failing earl when Swedish raiders press his borders? His voice hardened. Or did you think we wouldn't know about that? The tension in the hall thickened like blood congealing on a blade. Warriors shifted their weight, hands drifting closer to weapons. But Ragnar held up a hand, stilling any potential violence. I have no quarrel with King Horik, he continued, his tone reasonable. In fact, I mean to offer him something far more valuable than Haraldsson's tired loyalty. I will bring him glory and riches from lands that old men fear to raid. I will extend his influence to shores that have never heard his name. His smile was sharp as a blade in winter. All I ask is that he let this matter resolve itself naturally, between me and the Earl. Halfdan's eyes narrowed. You speak of the western lands. Those are children's tales, nothing more. Are they? Ragnar moved to a covered object that had stood unnoticed against one wall. With a flourish, he pulled away the cloth, revealing a table laden with treasures, golden crosses, silver chalices, illuminated manuscripts whose pages gleamed with precious pigments. These came from a single monastery, ripe for plucking like an autumn apple, and there are hundreds more waiting for warriors bold enough to claim them. The envoy's eyes widened at the display of wealth, their carefully maintained diplomatic masks slipping for just a moment. Ragnar pressed his advantage, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Think on this. If Haraldsson prevails, these opportunities die with me. The old earl fears change more than death itself. But if I succeed... He gestured to encompass the hall, the warriors, the future itself. If I succeed, every ship in King Horik's fleet can sail west to glory. Every warrior in his service can win fame and riches beyond imagining. He stepped back, spreading his arms wide. So yes, I stand accused of rebellion. I stand accused of seeing a future that old men are too frightened to grasp. Let history judge whether that makes me a criminal or a visionary. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Halfdan stroked his grey beard, his eyes moving from the treasure to Ragnar and back again. When he spoke, his words were carefully chosen. The king's judgment will come when this matter is settled one way or another. Until then, he understands that local disputes sometimes must be resolved locally. He straightened his shoulders. But know this, Ragnar Lothbrok, if you prevail, the crown will expect compensation for its understanding. Of course, Ragnar's smile was genuine this time. I would expect nothing less. After the envoys departed, Floki materialized from the shadows where he had been watching the exchange. Clever words, my friend, but words are wind, and the storm that comes will demand more than promises. Then we'll give it blood instead, Ragnar replied. He turned to where Thorstein waited. Are the ships ready? Aye, 2 of our fastest, already positioned upriver. The men await only your command. Then let's not keep them waiting. Ragnar's eyes gleamed with anticipation. It's time to show the world what happens to those who stand against us. The assault on Erikstad began in that strange hour before dawn, when even the birds hold their breath. Ragnar's ships, carried by the swift current and skillful rowing, swept down upon the settlement like Odin's own fury. The fortress that Sigurd Eriksson had thought unassailable proved vulnerable to an attack from a direction he had never thought to guard. Ragnar led the first wave himself, his axes singing their deadly song as they crashed through the minimal resistance. Behind him came Rollo, his massive frame dealing death with every swing of his sword. And behind them both, young Bjorn led the third wave with a combination of youthful energy and carefully trained precision. The slaughter was methodical, almost artistic in its execution. Warriors who surrendered were given a choice: swear allegiance to Ragnar or feed the ravens. Those who resisted were granted no choice at all. The fortress's defenders, caught between sleep and waking, fell like wheat before the scythe. Sigurd Eriksson himself proved worthy of his reputation for bravery, if not for wisdom. The nobleman managed to organize a pocket of resistance in his great hall, but it was a doomed effort. Ragnar's forces had already freed the thralls, many of whom turned on their former masters with the savage joy of the long-oppressed finally tasting vengeance. The final confrontation came as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Sigurd, his once fine clothes stained with the blood of his own men, faced Ragnar in single combat before the assembled survivors. "You break the natural order," Sigurd spat, his sword describing elegant arcs as he circled his opponent. "Gods and kings decree that men should know their place." "The gods decree nothing of the sort," Ragnar replied, his axes moving with deadly precision. "They favor the bold, the ambitious. They smile on those who dare to rise above their station." His laugh was cold as a northern wind. "Besides, your gods seem remarkably absent today." The duel was brief but spectacular, a display of skill that would be remembered in songs and sagas. Sigurd's traditional sword techniques, learned from expensive masters, proved inadequate against Ragnar's innovative combination of axework and subtle footwork. The nobleman's head joined those of his most loyal warriors on spikes before his own gates, a message that would be understood from the smallest village to the king's hall itself. As the flames consumed Erikstad's great hall, Ragnar gathered the survivors, both the conquered warriors who had sworn him allegiance and the freed thralls who had helped secure his victory. His voice carried clearly over the crackle of the inferno. "Remember this day," he commanded. "Remember how Sigurd Eriksson thought his walls and his noble blood would protect him. Remember how wrong he was." His smile was fierce in the firelight. "This is only the beginning. Those who stand with us will share in glory and riches beyond imagining. Those who stand against us—" He gestured to the heads on spikes. "They will be remembered only as examples." Young Bjorn stood at his father's side, his face still flushed with the exertion of his first command. The boy had acquitted himself well, showing tactical insight that belied his years. Yet there was something in his eyes, a shadow, a question, that spoke to the weight of the day's events. "You did well," Ragnar told him quietly, as the warriors began the work of stripping the fortress of anything valuable. "How does it feel having men's lives in your hands?" "Heavy," Bjorn replied after a moment's thought, "like carrying a shield that grows heavier with each step." He looked up at his father. "Does it ever get lighter?" "No." Ragnar's voice held no judgment, only truth. "The weight grows with each command, each decision. The trick is learning to carry it without letting it break you." He gripped his son's shoulder. "That's what separates true leaders from mere warriors. the ability to bear that weight and keep walking forward. As if to punctuate his words, a raven landed on one of the spikes displaying Sigurd's head. The bird's harsh cry echoed off the fortress walls and was answered by dozens of its brothers circling overhead. The sight sent a visible shiver through many of the warriors, who remembered the seer's prophecies about ravens and destiny. Floki appeared at Ragnar's side, his eyes wild with religious fervor. "Do you see?" he whispered. "The gods approve our offering. They hunger for more." "Then we'll feed them well," Ragnar promised, his voice carrying to all assembled. "This is only the first sacrifice on our altar of ambition. By the time we're done, the ravens will grow fat on the flesh of those who oppose us, and the skalds will struggle to keep pace with our deeds." He turned to survey the burning fortress, the spikes with their grisly decorations, the warriors who had bound their fates to his rising star. The smoke from the fires rose into the dawn sky like offerings to gods who demanded blood for glory, pain for greatness. The curse that the seer had spoken of seemed to hover in the air like wood smoke, invisible but present, weaving itself into the fabric of Ragnar's destiny with each life he took, each step he took toward the crown that awaited him. Yet he welcomed it, embraced it, knowing that the greatest sagas were written not in ink but in blood. As the sun climbed higher, painting the scene in stark lights and deeper shadows, Ragnar Lothbrok smiled his wolf smile and began planning his next move in the great game of power and prophecy. The ravens circled overhead, their cries a chorus of triumph and doom, while below them a legend continued to forge itself in blood and fire. Victory carried the metallic taste of betrayal on the evening Ragnar Lothbrok discovered the serpent in his midst. The celebrations following their successful raid on Vestfold had barely begun when the truth emerged, carried on the wings of a dying man's confession and written in the blood of 15 good warriors who had fallen into an expertly laid ambush. The great hall of their newly captured fortress echoed with the sounds of revelry, warriors drinking to their success, freed thralls celebrating their new positions, skalds already crafting verses about the day's battle. The air hung heavy with the scent of roasted meat and spilled mead, sweet smoke rising from the central hearth to gather like storm clouds beneath the timber rafters. Ragnar sat in the high seat that until morning had belonged to the fortress's previous owner, his fingers drumming a thoughtful rhythm on the carved armrest. His eyes, cold as a frozen fjord, watched the celebrations with the detached interest of a wolf observing prey. Beside him, Bjorn stood with the quiet alertness he had developed since taking his first command, the boy's hand never straying far from his sword hilt. The hall's atmosphere shifted like wind before a storm when Thorstein entered. The warrior's face was grim, his armor still stained with blood from the battle's aftermath. He made his way directly to Ragnar, ignoring offers of drink and celebration. "He's ready to talk," Thorstein reported quietly, his voice pitched for Ragnar's ears alone. "The wound is mortal. He won't last the night." Ragnar rose with fluid grace, his movement drawing every eye in the hall. The revelry dimmed as warriors sensed the change in their leader's demeanor. "Bring him," Ragnar commanded, his soft voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Let everyone see what it means to betray our cause." They dragged the dying man into the center of the hall. Erik Thorvaldsson, once a respected warrior in Ragnar's inner circle, now pale and bleeding from a gut wound that no healer could mend. His eyes darted around the hall like a trapped animal's, taking in the faces of men he had fought beside, men he had betrayed. "Speak," Ragnar ordered, standing over the wounded man. "Tell them how Earl Haraldsson's silver bought your loyalty. Tell them how you fed him information about our movements, our plans, our strengths." His voice remained conversational, almost gentle. "Tell them how you led 15 of your shield brothers into an ambush this morning." Eric's laugh turned into a wet cough, blood staining his beard. "They said you would destroy everything. The old ways, the natural order." He struggled to focus on Ragnar's face. "Haraldsson promised gold, lands, titles, everything a warrior dreams of." "And now you die with neither honor nor profit," Ragnar observed, "a fitting end for a man who betrays his sworn oath." He knelt beside the dying warrior, his voice dropping to a whisper that nonetheless carried in the hushed hall. "But you weren't alone, were you, Eric? No man orchestrates such betrayal without help. The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implication. Warriors shifted uneasily, hands drifting toward weapons as each man wondered who else might be named. Eric's eyes darted to a specific point in the crowd, a movement so quick it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant man, but Ragnar had been watching for exactly such a tell. "Huh?" he breathed, rising to his full height. "So that's how it is." His gaze fixed on a point in the crowd. "Ulf Haraldsson, step forward." The named warrior froze like a deer scenting a wolf. Ulf was a respected fighter, one of the first to join Ragnar's cause, his loyalty supposedly proven in 3 battles. Now he stood revealed as a viper in their midst, his face draining of color as warriors stepped away from him, creating an island of empty space around the discovered traitor. "My lord," Ulf began, his hand moving toward his sword, "this dying man speaks madness." "Take his weapons," Ragnar ordered softly. Warriors moved to comply, disarming Ulf with swift efficiency. "Now, shall we settle this as honorable men? A duel, perhaps? You against me before the gods and these witnesses?" Hope flickered in Ulf's eyes, the hope of a man seeing a chance, however slim, at survival. "Yes, yes, my lord. A duel as tradition demands." Ragnar's smile was terrible to behold. "Bring him outside. Let's do this properly." They assembled in the fortress courtyard, where the last light of day painted the sky in shades of blood and steel. Torches had been lit, their flames guttering in the evening breeze, casting dramatic shadows across the gathered crowd. The air was thick with tension, and the metallic scent of spilled blood that still lingered from the day's battle. Ulf stood in the center of the hastily formed circle, a sword returned to his hand. He moved with the confidence of a skilled warrior, testing his blade's balance as he waited for Ragnar to arm himself. That confidence began to waver when Ragnar simply stood watching him, making no move to draw a weapon. "My lord!" Ulf's voice carried a tremor now. "Shall we begin?" "Oh, I think we're well past the beginning," Ragnar replied softly. His eyes swept the crowd of watching warriors. "Tell me, what is the punishment for oath-breaking in our lands?" "Death," came the unanimous response from dozens of throats. "And for betraying shield brothers to their enemies?" "Death! And for serving 2 masters, taking silver from one while swearing loyalty to another?" "Death!" Ulf's face had gone pale as snow. But you said a duel." "I said we would settle this as tradition demands," Ragnar corrected him. His voice was almost gentle, the tone a father might use when explaining an important lesson to a child. "And tradition demands that traitors die. I never specified how." He raised his voice to address the gathered warriors. 15 men died this morning because this oathbreaker sold their lives for Earl Haraldsson's silver. 15 warriors who will never see their families again, never drink in Odin's hall, never share in the glory we fight for. His eyes were colder than midwinter ice. "The gods demand payment for such betrayal. Who are we to deny them?" Understanding dawned in Ulf's eyes too late. He turned to run, but warriors seized him before he could take 2 steps. They dragged him to the center of the courtyard, where a wooden block, hastily but sturdy constructed, waited. "Please," Ulf begged, his previous warrior's dignity forgotten. "My lord, I can explain everything. Haraldsson threatened my family, my children, and now they'll grow up knowing their father died a traitor's death." Ragnar cut him off. "Let this be a lesson to them and to everyone who might think to follow your example." He drew his axe with deliberate slowness. "In this new world we're building, there is no room for men who cannot keep their oaths." "Mercy!" Ulf's scream echoed off the fortress walls. "For the love of the gods, show mercy." "The gods show no mercy to oath-breakers," Ragnar replied. "Why should I be more forgiving than they?" The axe fell with surgical precision, and Ulf's head joined Eric's corpse in the pile of traitors' bodies that would feed the ravens. Ragnar wiped his blade clean with methodical care, his eyes sweeping the assembled warriors. "Let it be known," he proclaimed, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard, "that this is the fate of all who betray our cause. I care not for your reasons, your excuses, your pitiful attempts at justification. Betray me, and you die. Betray your shield brothers, and you die. Betray our dream of a better world, and you die." His smile was sharp as a blade in winter. The choice is yours, but know that I will not hesitate to feed the ravens with the flesh of traitors." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind and the distant calls of ravens gathering for their feast. Warriors looked at each other with new wariness, each man wondering who else might be harboring divided loyalties. Bjorn appeared at his father's side, the boy's face thoughtful as he studied the corpse of the man he had once called friend. "Was there no other way?" "There is always another way," Ragnar replied quietly. "The trick is choosing the path that serves our purpose best. Today we needed an example more than we needed mercy." He gripped his son's shoulder. "Remember this, boy. A leader's justice must be swift, certain, and memorable. The next man who thinks to betray us will remember Ulf's screams, and perhaps think better of it." As darkness settled over the fortress like a burial shroud, Floki emerged from the shadows, where he had been watching the proceedings. The shipwright's eyes gleamed with an unsettling light as he studied the growing pool of blood beneath the execution block. "The ravens sing a new song," he observed, his voice carrying its usual edge of madness. "They taste betrayal on the wind and hunger for more. The curse works its way deeper with each life you take, my friend." "Then let it work," Ragnar replied, watching as his men disposed of the traitor's corpse. "Every great saga needs its dark chapters. Every crown worth wearing demands its price in blood." His smile was wolf-sharp in the gathering gloom. "And I mean to wear a crown that will make the gods themselves tremble." The ravens circled overhead, their cries a chorus of triumph and doom. And beneath them, Ragnar Lothbrok continued forging his legend in blood and betrayal, each death another step on the path to his cursed destiny. Destiny wore a woman's face on the morning Aslaug arrived at Ragnar's war camp. She came as dawn broke over the blood-soaked fortress, the morning mist parting before her like a veil. Her beauty struck those who saw her like a physical blow, but it was her eyes that commanded attention, eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment into realms of possibility that ordinary mortals could only dream of. Lagertha watched the newcomers approach from the fortress walls, her hand resting casually on her sword hilt. The shield maiden's face betrayed nothing, but those who knew her well could read tension in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held herself like a drawn bow waiting to loose its arrow. Ragnar stood in the courtyard where Ulf's blood still stained the execution block, studying the approaching woman with the calculating gaze that had become his hallmark. The air seemed to thicken with possibility and tension, as if the gods themselves held their breath to see what would unfold. "Ragnar Lothbrok," Aslaug's voice carried the weight of prophecy. "The gods sent me dreams of you, dreams of glory and doom, of crowns and curses, of betrayals yet to come." "The gods seem unusually interested in my affairs lately," Ragnar replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Though they send more warnings than blessings. Perhaps because you need them more." Aslaug moved closer, her grace making the blood-stained courtyard seem suddenly crude and barbaric. "I see the path you walk, son of kings. It leads to greatness beyond imagining, but the price—" She shook her head slowly. "The price will break hearts and shatter oaths." A muscle twitched in Ragnar's jaw, the only outward sign that her words had struck home. Before he could respond, Lagertha descended from the walls to stand beside her husband. The contrast between the two women was stark. Lagertha in her warrior's gear, practical and deadly. Aslaug in her fine clothes, ethereal and mysterious. "You speak of prices and prophecies." Lagertha's voice carried the edge of steel beneath its surface courtesy. "But you haven't told us why you're here." "I'm here because the gods willed it." Aslaug's eyes met Ragnar's with unsettling directness. "I'm here because your destiny requires it." "Destiny. I'm here because the curse that's already begun to work its way into your soul needs a catalyst to fulfill its purpose." The tension in the courtyard ratcheted higher. Warriors who had been pretending not to watch now abandoned all pretense, gathering to witness what felt like a pivotal moment in their saga. Floki materialized from somewhere in the crowd, his kohl-rimmed eyes wide with religious fervor. "She speaks truth," the shipwright declared, his voice carrying its usual edge of madness. "The ravens told me she was coming. They sang of changes and choices, of paths diverging like rivers in spring flood." "Enough." Ragnar's command cut through the growing murmurs like a blade. "Take our guest to the great hall. See that she's given food and drink. We'll speak more of destinies and curses after I've attended to more immediate concerns." But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As if summoned by the tension of the moment, a horn blast cut through the morning air, the signal for approaching riders. Moments later, Thorstein appeared on the walls. "My lord, Earl Haraldsson's army approaches from the south, at least 500 warriors under his banner." The response was immediate and practiced. Warriors rushed to their positions, while archers took their places on the walls. Through it all, Ragnar remained still, his eyes never leaving Aslau's face. "You knew they were coming," he said. It wasn't a question. "I saw it in my dreams," she confirmed, "as I saw what happens next. The choice you make here today will echo through generations." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every ear. "Choose wrongly, and everything you've built will turn to ash in your hands." "Then what is the right choice?" Lagertha demanded, her patience clearly wearing thin. Aslaug's smile was sad and knowing. "That's not for me to say. The gods show us paths, not destinations. They delight in watching us stumble through the darkness of our own making." Ragnar's laugh was sharp and sudden. "Then we'll give them a show worth watching." He raised his voice to address his gathered warriors. "The Earl comes with 500 men. Good, let him come. Let him see what happens when old power meets new ambition." He began issuing orders with the precision that had made him legendary. Forces were positioned, traps prepared, strategies set in motion. Through it all, Aslaug watched with those unsettling eyes, as if she were seeing not just the present moment, but all possible futures branching from it. The battle that followed would be sung of in Skald's halls for generations. Earl Haraldsson had indeed brought 500 warriors, but they were men who fought from habit and duty. Ragnar's forces, though outnumbered, fought with the fervor of those who had chosen their cause and their leader. Ragnar himself led the defense from the walls, his tactical genius turning the fortress's every feature into a weapon. Boiling oil and burning pitch rained down on the attackers, while archers picked off officers with methodical precision. When the Earl's forces finally breached the outer wall, they found themselves channeled into killing grounds, where Ragnar's shield walls extracted a brutal toll for every step gained. Lagertha commanded the defense of the inner bailey, her shield wall moving with the coordinated precision of a single organism. Beside her, young Bjorn proved again why Ragnar had such faith in his development, leading countercharges that threw back multiple attempts to establish a foothold. Through it all, Aslaug stood on the highest tower, watching the battle unfold like a Valkyrie choosing which souls would feast in Valhalla. Her presence seemed to affect both sides. Ragnar's warriors fought with increased fervor when they caught sight of her, while the Earl's men whispered that Odin himself had sent a shield maiden to curse their efforts. The turning point came as the sun reached its zenith. Earl Haraldsson, frustrated by the mounting casualties, committed his personal guard to a frontal assault on the main gate. It was exactly what Ragnar had been waiting for. Hidden doors in the fortress walls burst open, disgorging warriors who had circled through secret passages to emerge behind the Earl's forces. Caught between hammer and anvil, the attack crumbled into chaos. Ragnar himself led the final charge, his axes dealing death with mechanical precision as he fought his way toward where Haraldsson's banner still flew. The Earl proved himself a warrior worthy of his position, holding his ground as his men fell around him. But he was an old wolf facing a young one, and when their blades finally met, the outcome was never really in doubt. Ragnar's axe took Haraldsson in the throat, sending his body tumbling from his horse like a puppet with cut strings. As the Earl's remaining forces surrendered or fled, Ragnar stood over his fallen enemy's corpse. Blood dripped from his axes as he surveyed the carnage, his eyes finally rising to where Aslaug still watched from her perch. "Is this what you saw in your dreams?" he called up to her. "Is this the choice that echoes through generations?" "This?" Her laugh was musical and terrible. "This was merely prologue, Ragnar Lothbrok. The real choices, the ones that will damn or save you, still lie ahead." She gestured to where Lagertha approached across the corpse-strewn courtyard. "Starting now." Understanding dawned in Lagertha's eyes as she looked between her husband and the mysterious Cirrus. "So that's how it is," she said softly. The price of your crown begins with betrayal close to home. No, Ragnar started to say, but Aslog cut him off. The gods demand balance, she declared. Glory requires sacrifice. Power demands payment in pain. You cannot rise without costs, Ragnar Lothbrok, and the first payment comes due now. The tension between the three of them was palpable, a thing alive and writhing in the blood-soaked air. Around them, warriors began the grim work of dealing with the dead, but all eyes kept straying to the tableau their leaders presented. Floki appeared beside them, his eyes wild with religious ecstasy. "Do you see now?" he asked no one in particular. "Do you see how the curse works its way deeper? Every victory breeds new conflicts. Every triumph carries the seeds of future pain." "Enough!" Ragnar's voice cracked like a whip. "We've won a great victory here. The Earl is dead, his army broken. What comes next?" He looked between Lagertha and Aslaug, his face unreadable. "What comes next is for another day." But even as he spoke the words, everyone present knew that something fundamental had shifted. The ravens circled overhead, their cries a chorus of change and challenge, while below them the first real price of Ragnar's ambition began to make itself felt. As night fell over the battlefield, three figures stood in separate corners of the fortress, each lost in their own thoughts. Ragnar in the great hall, staring into the flames as he weighed destiny against desire. Lagertha in the practiced yard, her sword singing through forms as she contemplated the cost of loving an ambitious man, and Aslaug in her tower, watching the stars wheel overhead as she waited for prophecy to fulfill itself. The curse that the seer had spoken of seemed to pulse in the very stones of the fortress, growing stronger with each drop of blood spilled, each oath strained, each heart torn between love and ambition. And somewhere in the darkness, the gods smiled their cruel smiles, knowing that this was only the beginning of the price that greatness would demand. Power tasted of iron and ash in the great hall of Kattegat as Ragnar Lothbrok claimed his victory. The Earl's high seat, carved with serpents and wolves, bore dark stains where Haraldsson's blood had soaked into ancient wood. The air hung heavy with wood smoke and tension, as nobles and warriors gathered to witness how a farmer would wear the mantle of rulership. Ragnar sat in that blood-stained chair with the casual confidence of a wolf in its den, his fingers trailing over the carved armrests as if reading prophecies in the worn patterns. He had traded his battle-stained leather for rich cloth and silver arm rings, though his axes still hung ready at his belt. The transformation from rebel to ruler was a performance, and Ragnar understood the importance of every detail. "The old Earl's supporters still hold the northern settlements," Thorstein reported, his voice carrying in the hushed hall. "They speak of resistance, of tradition, of divine right." A cruel smile crossed the warrior's face. "They speak much, but act little." "Words are wind," Ragnar replied, his voice soft yet carrying to every corner of the hall. "Let them talk while we act. How many ships remain loyal to the old Earl's family?" 12 longships, scattered among 3 harbours. The crews are uncertain, waiting to see which way the tide of power flows. "Then let's show them." Ragnar's smile was sharp as a blade in winter. "Bring in the prisoners." They dragged in Earl Haraldsson's surviving supporters, nobles and warriors who had fought to the end, who had rejected Ragnar's initial offers of clemency. They were proud men from old families, their fine clothes now stained with dirt from the cells. Yet they held themselves with dignity as they faced their conqueror. Sigurd the Elder, patriarch of a noble house that traced its lineage back 10 generations, stepped forward to speak for the group. "Whatever you intend, be quick about it. If you mean to execute us, do it cleanly. We are not thralls to be tormented for your amusement." "Execute you?" Ragnar's laugh held genuine amusement. "Why would I waste such valuable resources?" He rose from the high seat with fluid grace, moving to stand before the prisoners. "You are men of influence, of respected bloodlines. Your words carry weight in the northern settlements. Your ships are strong, your warriors skilled." His voice dropped to an intimate tone that nonetheless carried to every ear. "I offer you a choice, not between life and death, but between past and future." He began to pace, his movement drawing every eye. "The old ways served us well once, but the world changes. While other earls cling to tradition, I see opportunities they're too blind to grasp. The western lands lie ripe for plunder, their wealth protected only by soft men who worship a weak god. His eyes blazed with vision and ambition. Join me. Keep your lands, your titles, your honor. Add your strength to mine, and together we'll write a saga that will echo through the ages. Murmurs filled the hall as the prisoners exchanged glances. Ragnar continued, his voice taking on an edge of steel. Or cling to the past, to your memories of how things were. But know that the future comes whether you embrace it or not. Those who resist change will be swept aside by its tide. Sigurd the Elder studied Ragnar with eyes that had seen 60 winters. And if we refuse, if we choose to remain loyal to the old ways, then you'll have chosen your own fate. Ragnar's smile never wavered. Your lands will be given to younger sons who hunger for opportunity. Your ships will sail under captains who understand that loyalty to the future outweighs loyalty to the past. Your names will be forgotten, your bloodlines ended. He spread his hands in a gesture of false regret. The choice, as always, is yours. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and fear. These were proud men, raised on tales of honor and tradition. But they were also practical men who had seen how Ragnar's star had risen. One by one they knelt, swearing new oaths to their conqueror. Only Sigurd remained standing, his aged frame straight as a spear. My grandfather's grandfather helped build this hall, he said quietly. Our blood is in these stones, our stories in these timbers. You speak of the future, Ragnar Lothbrok, but you understand nothing of the weight of the past. I understand that the past is dead weight to those who carry it too heavily, Ragnar replied. His voice held something almost like kindness. The question is whether you'll drag your house down with you, or allow it to rise under new leadership. He raised his voice slightly. Bring in the boy. A young man was led into the hall, Sigurd's grandson, barely 16 winters old. The boy's face showed signs of recent beating, though he held himself with inherited pride. Young Sigurd here has a better understanding of how the wind blows, Ragnar announced. He came to us 3 days ago, offering his loyalty and his father's ships in exchange for recognition as the new head of your house. His smile was wolf-sharp. The future belongs to those bold enough to grasp it, old man. Even your own blood understands this. The elder Sigurd's face went pale as he stared at his grandson. You would betray your own blood, the traditions of our house? I would see our house survive, the young man replied, his voice steady despite his bruises. I would see it thrive in the new world that comes rather than die clinging to the old one. Something broke in the old man's eyes. His shoulders slumped as the weight of generations seemed to press down upon him. Then our saga is truly over, he whispered. No, Ragnar corrected him. It merely takes a new turn. Kneel with the others, swear your oath, and your house continues under your leadership. Refuse, and young Sigurd here becomes patriarch today. He paused significantly. Choose wisely, old friend. The ravens grow hungry. In the end, they all knelt. They swore their oaths on swords and arm rings, binding their houses to Ragnar's rising star. Each oath was another strand in the web of power he wove, another piece in the grand game he played. As the ceremony concluded, Floki materialized from the shadows where he had been watching. The shipwright's eyes gleamed with their usual mix of madness and insight. They think you're offering them choices, he observed, his voice pitched for Ragnar's ears alone. They don't see that every choice leads down paths you've already mapped, to destinations you've already chosen. The greatest trap is one where the prey believes it has options, Ragnar agreed softly. These men will serve me better believing they chose this path themselves. And did they? Choose freely? Floki's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. Or did you simply make the alternative so unthinkable that only a fool would choose it? There's always a choice, Ragnar replied, watching as his new vassals were led away to feast their altered allegiances. They could choose death, exile, obscurity. They could choose to stand against the tide of change. His smile was cold. That they choose to swim with the current rather than drown in it merely proves they're not completely blind to reality. The hall gradually emptied as warriors and nobles moved to the feast that would celebrate their new bonds of loyalty. Ragnar remained in the high seat, his fingers still tracing patterns in the ancient wood. The weight of rulership settled around his shoulders like a cloak of lead. yet he wore it with the same ease he had once worn a farmer's rough wool. Bjorn approached through the emptying hall, his young face thoughtful. "You didn't give them real choices," he observed. "You manipulated them into doing exactly what you wanted." "I gave them the only choices that matter," Ragnar corrected his son. "The choice between adapting and dying, between growth and stagnation." He met the boy's eyes directly. "Remember this lesson, son. True power isn't about forcing people to do what you want. It's about making them want to do what you need." "And what of honor, of the old ways?" "Honor is a sword that cuts both ways," Ragnar replied. "It can strengthen bonds between warriors, or it can blind men to changing times." He gestured to encompass the hall, the throne, the future itself. "We stand at a crossroads of history, boy. The old world is dying, and a new one struggles to be born. Those who cling to the past will be swept away by the tide of change. Those who embrace the future will ride that tide to glory." As if to punctuate his words, ravens landed on the roof beams overhead. Their harsh cries echoed through the hall like a chorus of approval or warning. Ragnar smiled up at them, accepting whatever omens they brought. "The gods themselves understand the necessity of change," he continued. "Odin sacrificed his eye for wisdom, hung himself for knowledge. He understood that power requires sacrifice, that growth demands transformation. His eyes grew distant, seeing visions of glory yet to come. We stand on the edge of greatness, son. The raids we'll launch, the lands we'll conquer, the saga we'll write. It all begins here with these choices, these moments of transformation." The ravens called again, their voices mixing with the distant sounds of feast and celebration. Below them, father and son sat in the gathering darkness, while around them the weight of destiny grew heavier with each beat of black wings. The future was coming, carrying glory and doom in equal measure. And Ragnar Lothbrok smiled his wolf's smile, knowing that every oath sworn, every choice manipulated, brought him one step closer to the cursed crown that waited in his dreams. The feast that followed the oath-taking filled Kattegat's great hall with warmth and calculated revelry. Torches cast dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed generations of power-changing hands, while the scent of roasted meat and spilled mead mingled with wood smoke and ambition. At the high table, Ragnar watched his newly sworn vassals with the patient attention of a wolf studying its pack. It was Lagertha who first noticed the shift in the hall's atmosphere. The Shield Maiden's warrior instincts, honed through countless battles, sensed the change before it manifested. Aslaug had entered, her presence drawing every eye like a lodestone draws iron. She moved through the crowd with ethereal grace, her beauty somehow heightened by the martial surroundings, until she stood before the high table. "The gods have shown me your path clearly now, Ragnar Lothbrok," she announced, her voice carrying over the suddenly hushed hall. "You will have your crown, your glory, your legend. But the price—" Her eyes shifted to Lagertha. "The price begins with a choice made here tonight." Lagertha rose from her seat, her movement fluid and deadly as a drawn blade. "There is no choice to make," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of battles won and trust betrayed. "You've seen his path? I've walked it with him. You speak of his destiny, I've bled for it." The tension in the hall crystallized like ice in midwinter. Warriors and nobles drew back, creating an empty space around the two women who faced each other before Ragnar's seat. Here was power meeting power, will meeting will, each formidable in her own way. "The gods demand sacrifice," Aslaug replied, her tone gentle but implacable as fate itself. "They care nothing for what we have earned, only for what price we're willing to pay." "Then let them demand it of someone else." Lagertha's hand didn't move to her weapon, but every warrior present could read the violence barely contained in her stance. "I've sacrificed enough for one man's ambition." Ragnar watched the exchange with unreadable eyes, his fingers still tracing patterns in the ancient wood of his throne. The weight of destiny seemed to press down upon the hall like a physical force, demanding resolution. It was Lagertha who broke the impasse. She turned to face her husband, and in that moment, every warrior present saw why she had been legendary before ever meeting Ragnar Lothbrok. Her beauty and ferocity combined into something transcendent, a Valkyrie come to earth. "I will not be a pawn in the game of gods and kings," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "I loved you when you were a farmer dreaming of glory. I fought beside you when you became a rebel reaching for power. I would have ruled with you as you claimed your crown." Her smile was sad, but fierce. "But I will not share you, not even for destiny's sake." She removed the arm ring that marked her as his wife, placing it on the table before him with deliberate care. The sound of gold meeting wood seemed to echo in the hushed hall. "Your path leads to glory and doom, my love," she continued, her voice softening for just a moment. "But it is no longer my path to walk. Rule well, build your legend, but do it without me." Before anyone could respond, she turned and strode from the hall, her head high and her step unwavering. Warriors parted before her like waves before the prow of a ship, many touching their weapons in salute as she passed. In that moment, she was every inch a queen, not because of any man's crown, but by the sheer force of her own nature. Ragnar watched her go, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts. When she had vanished into the night, he raised his drinking horn as if nothing momentous had occurred. "To the future," he declared, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "To destiny? To glory? To the price we pay for greatness?" The feast resumed, though something had changed in its tenor. Warriors and nobles alike watched their new earl with a combination of awe and unease, sensing that they had witnessed something profound. Not just the end of a marriage, but the first true manifestation of the curse that the seer had promised. Bjorn alone remained perfectly still, his young face a study in contained emotion as he watched the door through which his mother had departed. Finally, he turned to his father. "Was it worth it?" he asked quietly. "This first payment for your crown?" Ragnar's smile was wolf-sharp in the torchlight. "Ask me again when we've written our names in the sagas, my son. Ask me again when they sing of our deeds in the halls of gods and men." Above them, ravens called in the darkness, their voices a chorus of triumph and warning. The curse had claimed its first price, but all who witnessed that night knew it would not be the last. The path to glory would demand more sacrifices, more pain, more betrayals. And Ragnar Lothbrok, once farmer and now earl, smiled his predator's smile and prepared to pay whatever price the gods demanded. Glory painted the horizon red as Ragnar's fleet sailed west, 30 ships strong, their dragon heads cutting through waves that no Norse vessel had dared challenge before. The morning sun caught on shield rims and spear points, while salt spray baptized warriors who had traded the certainty of farms and fishing for the promise of legend. Above them, ravens wheeled and called, following the ships as if they too hungered to see what lay beyond the edge of the known world. Ragnar stood at the prow of his flagship, the vessel Floki had built with equal parts genius and madness. The square sail, his innovation that had drawn mockery from traditional shipwrights, caught the wind that would carry them to glory or doom. His fingers traced the intricate carvings on the gunwale, serpents and wolves that seemed to move in the changing light, as if the ship itself anticipated the violence to come. "The men whisper that we sail to our deaths," Rollo observed, moving to stand beside his brother. Salt spray had soaked his beard, making him look like some ancient sea god risen from the depths. "They say the world ends where the map stops, that monsters wait in the western mists." "Good." Ragnar's smile was sharp as a blade in winter. "Let them whisper. Fear breeds focus, and focused men fight better." He turned to study the fleet that followed in their wake. "Besides, they'll whisper different tales when we return with English gold around our necks." The journey west tested every innovation Ragnar had incorporated into his ships. The square sails proved their worth, allowing them to tack against winds that would have stalled traditional vessels. The deeper keels kept them stable in waters that grew increasingly hostile. Even the sunstone, which many had mocked as sorcery, proved essential for navigation when clouds obscured the stars. 5 days out, they encountered their first true challenge. A storm rose from nowhere, turning the sea into a battleground of competing gods. Waves tall as fortress walls threatened to swallow ships whole, while wind and rain conspired to drive them off course. Lesser leaders might have turned back, seeing divine warning in the tempest's fury. Ragnar saw opportunity. "Keep west," he commanded, his voice carrying over the storm's rage. "The English don't expect raiders in weather like this. Their guards will be sheltered, their watchfires doused. We'll fall upon them like Odin's own fury. His prediction proved prophetic. When the storm finally broke, they found themselves approaching a coastline unlike anything in their experience. Green hills rolled down to grey beaches, while in the distance the morning mist revealed the spires of an abbey that seemed to touch the clouds themselves. Ragnar gathered his chiefs for the final planning. Each was a warrior of proven worth, chosen not just for their fighting skill, but for their ability to think beyond the old ways of raiding. "Remember," he instructed, his voice carrying the weight of destiny, "we're not just here for gold. We're here to write the first pages of a new saga. Every action, every kill, every moment of mercy or cruelty must serve our greater purpose." His smile was wolf-sharp in the pre-dawn light. "When we return home, I want tales of this raid to spread across the Norse world like wildfire through summer grass." The attack itself was a masterpiece of timing and coordination. They struck at first light, when the transition between night and day watch left the abbey at its most vulnerable. The English had grown soft in their centuries of peace, never imagining that death could come from the sea with such precision and purpose. Ragnar led the first wave himself, his axes singing their deadly song as they crashed through the abbey's meager defenses. Behind him came Rollo, dealing death with the controlled savagery that had made him legendary even among Vikings. The brothers fought with the coordination of men who had trained together since childhood, each knowing exactly where the other would strike, how to cover each other's blind spots. The abbey's defenders, what few there were, fought with the desperate courage of men protecting their faith. But courage alone meant little against Norse steel and generations of combat experience. Within hours the complex was secured, its treasures being methodically catalogued and loaded onto waiting ships. It was more than mere plunder. Ragnar moved through the abbey's rooms with the careful attention of a man studying an opponent's weaknesses. He noted the construction techniques, the defensive layouts, the ways these foreign people organized their lives. Every detail was a weapon to be used in future raids. "Their god builds high walls," he observed to Floki, who was examining a golden crucifix with a mixture of fascination and disgust. "But they forget to make men strong enough to defend them." The shipwright's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. "Their god hangs on a tree like Odin seeking wisdom, but these soft men learn nothing from his sacrifice." He held up the crucifix, studying how it caught the light. "They make their god into gold and lock him away in towers. No wonder he doesn't protect them." The real treasure, beyond the gold and silver that would prove the raid's success, came in the form of a monk who spoke their tongue. The man had learned Norse from traders and now babbled information freely, hoping to buy his life with knowledge. "There are dozens more abbeys like this along the coast," he revealed, his eyes darting between the Viking chiefs who gathered to hear him. "Richer ones, bigger ones, and beyond them lie kingdoms wealthy beyond your imagining." Ragnar's smile was terrible to behold. "Tell me everything," he commanded. "Every coast, every harbor, every fortress and settlement. Speak true, and you'll live to see your god again. Lie." He let the threat hang unspoken in the air. The return journey was a triumph, beyond even Ragnar's carefully laid plans. Every ship rode low in the water, heavy with plunder. Warriors who had doubted their earl's vision now wore gold arm rings and spoke excitedly of future raids. More importantly, they carried something beyond mere treasure. They carried proof that the western lands existed, that they were rich beyond imagination, and that only Ragnar Lothbrok knew how to reach them. Their arrival in home waters caused a sensation that spread across the Norse world like wildfire. Ragnar had arranged it perfectly, timing their return to coincide with a gathering of chieftains and jarls. The sight of 30 ships laden with English treasure, of warriors wearing foreign gold and telling tales of lands ripe for plunder, sent shockwaves through the political landscape. King Horik himself came to witness the spectacle, his presence lending weight to what was already becoming legend. The king watched with carefully neutral expression as Ragnar's warriors unloaded their plunder, as the monk demonstrated his knowledge of their language and customs, as skalds already began composing verses about the raid that would change everything. "You've done what they said couldn't be done," Horik observed during the feast that followed. The king's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed his interest. "Sailed west, found rich lands, and returned to tell of it." "I've done what no one else dared to try," Ragnar corrected him. And this is only the beginning. With your blessing, my king, I mean to launch larger raids, not just against abbeys, but against their kingdoms themselves." He leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratoriality. "The English are rich but weak, divided among themselves. They've forgotten what it means to face real warriors. And you mean to remind them?" Horrick's smile was cold with calculation. "I mean to carve our names into their history so deeply they'll never forget them." Ragnar's eyes blazed with ambition and something darker. "Every raid will bring back not just plunder, but knowledge. Every victory will draw more warriors to our cause. Within 5 years we could hold English land, establish permanent settlements, extend your rule across the Western Sea itself." The king studied him thoughtfully, weighing ambition against risk, tradition against opportunity. Finally he nodded slowly. "You'll have your blessing and more. I'll provide additional ships, warriors from my own household. But remember this, Ragnar Lothbrok, you raid in my name, under my authority. The glory may be yours, but the power remains mine." "Of course, my king." Ragnar's smile betrayed nothing of his thoughts. "I seek only to serve the greater glory of our people." But later that night, as he stood alone on the beach watching his ships ride at anchor, Ragnar's mask slipped slightly. The moon painted the scene in shades of silver and shadow, while ravens circled overhead, their cries a chorus of prophecy and doom. "The power remains his," he whispered to the night air. "For now." Floki emerged from the darkness like a shadow given form, his eyes wild with religious fervor. "The gods smile on your ambition," the shipwright observed. "They send favorable winds, calm seas, rich targets." His laugh was sharp with madness. "But their smiles always hide teeth, my friend. Their gifts always carry poison." "Then let them smile. Let them scheme. Let them sharpen their teeth," Ragnar replied. His voice carried the weight of destiny. "I'll take their gifts and pay their price. I'll drink their poison and turn it into strength." He turned to face his oldest friend. "The curse they've laid on me. It's not a chain to bind me. It's a weapon to wield. Every sacrifice they demand makes me stronger. Every betrayal they engineer makes me wiser. Every price they exact brings me closer to the crown that waits in my future." Above them the ravens called louder, their voices mixing with the sound of waves on shore. And beneath them, Ragnar Lothbrok smiled his wolf's smile and began planning his next move in the great game of gods and kings. The saga was truly beginning now. The farmer had become an earl, the earl had become a legend, and the legend was about to become something that would shake the very foundations of the world. The curse that the seer had promised wound tighter with each step toward destiny. But Ragnar welcomed its embrace. Let the gods demand their price, and he would pay it gladly, in blood and pain and betrayal, knowing that each cost brought him closer to the crown that waited in his dreams. The ravens circled overhead, their cries a symphony of triumph and doom, while below them a legend continued to forge itself in blood and fire. Ambition's price was written in fire across the English sky as Ragnar Lothbrok's fleet, now 100 ships strong, descended upon Northumbria like Odin's own fury. The morning sun caught on countless shield rims and spear points, while smoke from burning settlements drew dark lines against the dawn. This was no mere raid. This was conquest, planned with the same meticulous attention that had transformed a farmer into a legend. King Ella's scouts had brought word of the approaching Norse fleet, but even their dire warnings hadn't prepared Northumbria for the scale of Ragnar's assault. The Vikings struck simultaneously at multiple points along the coast, each attack coordinated with precision that spoke of long planning and intimate knowledge of English defences. Ragnar himself led the main thrust toward York, his flagship's dragonhead cutting through river waters that had never before felt the kiss of Viking keels. He stood at the prow, resplendent in mail that spoke of his elevation from earl to something approaching kingship. Gold arm rings caught the light while his axes, the same weapons that had first tasted blood in a farmer's courtyard, hung ready at his belt. "The English think they know us now," he addressed the warriors gathered on his ship. 3 years of raids have taught them to fear our coming, but they don't understand. The raids were just practice, just testing of their defenses. His smile was sharp as a blade in winter. Today we show them what true Norse warfare means. The battle for York would be sung of in Sköld's halls for generations. Ragnar's forces struck with a combination of brutal force and subtle strategy that left the defenders reeling. While one group of warriors engaged the city's defenders in a frontal assault, other teams used siege equipment that Ragnar had adapted from his study of English fortifications. The city's proud walls, which had stood for centuries, began to crumble under the assault of Norse innovation combined with Norse savagery. King Ella himself led the defense, proving himself a worthy opponent. The English king matched Ragnar's tactical innovations with desperate creativity of his own, turning every street and building into a potential death trap for the invaders. But he was fighting against more than just warriors now. He was fighting against a legend that had been years in the making. The tide turned when Bjorn, now a man grown and hardened by years of warfare, led a daring assault over the city's northern wall. The young warrior had inherited his father's tactical genius along with his mother's fierce spirit, and he used both to devastating effect. His forces created a breach that allowed Ragnar's main army to pour into the city like a tide of iron and fury. The fighting in the streets was savage, with neither side asking or giving quarter. Ragnar led from the front, his axes dealing death with the same cold precision that had marked every step of his rise to power. Warriors who had followed him from his farming days fought beside nobles who had once scorned him, all united now in the pursuit of glory and plunder. King Ella made his final stand in the great hall of his fortress, surrounded by his most loyal thanes. The English king fought with the desperation of a man defending not just his life, but his entire way of life. Yet even as steel met steel and blood painted the ancient stones, Ragnar found himself admiring his opponent's courage. "You fought well," Ragnar told him during a brief pause in their combat. "The Skalds will sing of your bravery." "They'll sing of more than that," Ella spat back, blood running from a dozen minor wounds. "They'll sing of how the gods punish oathbreakers and usurpers. Your kind brings nothing but destruction, thinking it glory." "We bring change," Ragnar corrected him, his axes moving in their deadly dance. "The old world dies, and the new one is born in blood and fire. That's the only glory worth singing about." The duel ended as it had to, with Ragnar victorious and Ella on his knees, but rather than kill the English king, Ragnar did something that would be spoken of in whispers for generations. He offered terms. "Rule under me," he proposed, his voice carrying to every corner of the blood-soaked hall. "Keep your crown, your lands, your customs. Simply acknowledge Norse overlordship and pay tribute to our power." The hall fell silent, as warriors of both sides waited for Ella's response. The English king looked up at his conqueror with eyes that held equal parts hatred and understanding. "You think yourself clever," Ella said quietly, "offering mercy that costs you nothing while binding me with chains of gold and obligation. But I see the truth in your eyes, Ragnar Lothbrok. I see the curse that rides you like a shadow." Ragnar's laugh was genuine, if cold. "Cursed or blessed, I stand victorious while you kneel in your own hall. Choose quickly, king of nothing, death with honor or life with purpose." In the end, pragmatism won over pride. Ella swore his oaths, binding himself and his kingdom to Ragnar's rising star. It was a decisive victory, one that sent shockwaves through both English and Norse worlds. Here was proof that the Vikings were more than mere raiders. They were empire builders, shapers of a new world order. The aftermath of York's fall brought another significant change. King Horik, seeing how the balance of power had shifted, arrived in person to oversee the distribution of conquered territories. The aging king found Ragnar holding court in York's great hall, dispensing justice and organizing the consolidation of his gains with the same methodical attention he had once given to planning raids. "You've done what no Norse ruler has managed before," Horik observed during a private meeting. The king's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed calculation. "Conquered English land, established permanent control, created a bridge between our worlds." "All in your name, my king," Ragnar replied with equal care. "Every victory adds to your glory. Every conquest expands your influence." "Does it?" Horik's smile was cold. "My spies tell me your warriors no longer toast to my health in their victory celebrations." They speak of Ragnar the Conqueror, Ragnar the Legend, Ragnar who reaches beyond the edge of the known world to grasp glory. Men will always talk. Words are wind. Words become belief. Belief becomes power. Horik leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. I could have you killed where you sit, you know. One word from me and a dozen blades would find your heart before you could rise from that chair. Ragnar's smile was terrible to behold. You could try, he agreed pleasantly. But then you'd have to deal with my sons, my warriors, the legend I've built. You'd have to explain to every ambitious young Norse fighter why they shouldn't look west for glory. You'd have to convince men to stay home and fish when they could be conquering English kingdoms. The tension between them was palpable, heavy with the weight of power shifting like spring ice. Finally, Horik sat back with a grudging laugh. Well played, the king admitted. You've made yourself too valuable to kill, too dangerous to ignore, and too powerful to control. He studied Ragnar with something approaching admiration. So what happens now? Now, Ragnar's voice was soft. Now you make me your formal heir. Acknowledge me as the successor to your crown. In return, I continue to expand Norse power westward, continue to send you tribute, continue to rule in your name. His smile sharpened. For as long as you live. The threat was clear yet oddly courteous. Horik found himself laughing again, this time with genuine appreciation for the elegant brutality of it all. The gods must love you, he observed, or fear you. I'm not sure which would be more dangerous. The gods understand ambition, Ragnar replied. They respect strength and cunning. They know that power flows like water. It cannot be held back forever, only channeled in useful directions. The details were arranged with the same precision that had marked every step of Ragnar's rise. Horik would formally adopt him as heir, ensuring a smooth transition of power. In return, Ragnar would continue to expand Norse influence westward, building an empire that would straddle the sea itself. But even as Ragnar achieved this crowning achievement, signs of the curse's price began to manifest more clearly. Bjorn, celebrating their victory, was wounded in a seemingly minor skirmish, a wound that festered despite all attempts at healing. Rollo's loyalty, once absolute, began showing subtle cracks as he watched his brother's star continue to rise. And Aslaug's prophetic dreams grew darker, filled with images of blood and betrayal yet to come. Floki found Ragnar alone in York's great hall late one night, studying maps of territories yet to be conquered. The shipwright's eyes were wild with religious fervor as he watched his oldest friend plotting future glories. The gods laugh, he observed, his voice carrying its usual edge of madness. They watch you climb higher than any Norse ruler in history, knowing how far you'll eventually fall. Let them laugh, Ragnar replied without looking up from his maps. Every step I've taken, every victory I've won, has been paid for in blood and pain. If that's the price of immortality, I'll pay it gladly. Will you, even knowing the cost? Floki's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. The seer's prophecy grows clearer with each passing day. The curse winds tighter with each victory. Your own son lies burning with fever from a wound that should have healed weeks ago. Now Ragnar did look up, his eyes cold in the torchlight. Everything worthwhile has a price, old friend. The gods taught us that when Odin hung himself on Yggdrasil, when Thor paid for wisdom with pain. Why should my rise be any different? Because the price isn't just yours to pay, Floki countered. The curse touches everyone around you, your sons, your warriors, your people. Each victory breeds new enemies. Each triumph carries the seeds of future disaster. Then let it be so. Ragnar's voice carried the weight of destiny. Let the gods demand their price. Let them wind their curse tighter with each step I take. I'll build something that outlasts their petty games, something that will echo in the sagas long after they're forgotten. Above them, ravens called in the darkness. Whether Odin's messengers or mere birds, none could say. Their cries seemed to carry both triumph and warning, a chorus of destiny unfolding according to some vast and terrible plan. The curse that the seer had prophesied was no longer a distant threat, but a present reality, working its way through Ragnar's life like poison through blood. Yet he welcomed it, embraced it, wore it like a crown of thorns that proved his worthiness to reshape the world. Let the gods demand their price. He would pay it in full, knowing that each cost brought him closer to the legend he meant to become. The farmer was long dead, the earl transformed, the legend nearly complete. All that remained was to write the final chapters of his saga in blood and glory, no matter the cost to himself or those around him. The ravens circled overhead, their voices mixing with the wind that carried the scent of victory and doom in equal measure. And below them, Ragnar Lothbrok smiled his wolf's smile and continued plotting the course that would lead him to either immortality or destruction. Perhaps, he thought, they were the same thing in the end. History remembered the autumn of Ragnar's fall as the season of 1,000 ravens. They came first in scattered groups, then in swarms that darkened the skies above Kattegat, their harsh cries drowning out even the thunder of the restless sea. The air grew thick with their presence, heavy with portent that even the most hardened warriors could not ignore. Yet Ragnar Lothbrok, who had risen from farmer to king through blood and cunning, had long since stopped heeding such warnings. 10 years of victory had transformed him in ways subtle yet profound. Where once he had moved with a predator's careful precision, now he strode through his great hall with the casual arrogance of a man who had forgotten the taste of defeat. Gold weighed his arms, while a crown of raven's feathers and beaten metal sat upon his brow, like a physical manifestation of pride grown too heavy to bear. The great hall itself reflected this transformation. Gone were the simple timber walls and smoky hearths of his early rule. Now tapestries depicting his victories covered every surface, while English gold and Frankish silver gleamed in the light of 100 torches. The very air seemed perfumed with success, sweet with the incense of triumph. Yet beneath this glittering surface, rot had begun to take hold. Bjorn was the first to name it, though not the first to see it. He stood before his father's high seat, returned from raids along the Frankish coast that had yielded more blood than plunder. Time had hardened him into a warrior worthy of saga, yet something of his mother's fierce honesty remained in his eyes as he delivered news his father did not wish to hear. The western lands grow harder to raid with each passing season, he reported, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome truth. The Franks build ships in our style now, fortify their coasts with stone and steel. Each victory costs us more warriors, brings us less wealth. Then we'll sail further south. Ragnar dismissed the warning with a wave of his ring-laden hand. There are always new lands to conquer, new wealth to seize. The world is vast and we are legend. Are we? Bjorn's question cut through the perfumed air like a blade through silk. Or have we become what you once fought against, men so drunk on past glory they cannot see the future changing around them? The words should have struck deep, should have awakened the tactical genius that had transformed a farmer into king. Instead, they found only pride's armored shell, bouncing off like arrows from a shield wall. Before Ragnar could respond, horns sounded from the watchtowers. Not the brief notes of arriving ships, but the long, urgent blast that heralded dire news. Moments later, Thorstein burst into the hall, his face grave despite decades of friendship that had earned him the right to approach his king unannounced. "Rebellion in York," he reported, the words falling like stones into still water. "King Ella has broken his oaths. The English rise against us all along the coast." The news rippled through the hall like poison through blood. Warriors gripped weapons, while nobles exchanged worried glances. All eyes turned to Ragnar, waiting to see how the legendary tactician would respond to this threat to his legacy. What they saw was not the cold calculation that had won them an empire, but something altogether more dangerous, wounded pride masquerading as strength. "Gather the army," he commanded, his voice carrying the deadly softness that had once heralded the doom of earls and kings. "All of it. We'll remind the English why they learned to fear our coming." "My king," Thorstein's voice carried careful warning. "Winter approaches. The seas will be treacherous, the campaign season nearly done. Perhaps we should wait for spring." The legendary Ragnar Lothbrok afraid of winter seas. The king's laugh was sharp with dangerous pride. "Let them be treacherous. Let the gods themselves try to stop us. We'll show everyone that our power knows no season." The preparations for war carried none of the careful planning that had marked Ragnar's earlier campaigns. Pride and anger drove him now, Pushing aside the strategic brilliance that had won him his crown, he gathered ships and warriors with frantic intensity, ignoring the warnings of experienced captains who read the weather signs with growing concern. Even Floki, who had built the ships that first carried Norse ambition westward, tried to counsel delay. The shipwright's eyes were wild with religious dread as he confronted his oldest friend on the docks of Kattegat. "The gods themselves speak against this voyage," he declared, his voice carrying its usual edge of madness. "The ravens gather in unprecedented numbers, the sacrificial fires burn with unnatural colors, the very winds taste of doom." "The gods?" Ragnar's laugh was bitter. "The gods did not make me what I am. I carved my legend with steel and cunning, built my power with blood and pain. Let them gather their ravens, I'll feed the birds with English flesh." Yet even as he spoke, darker currents moved beneath the surface of his power. Rollo, his brother who had stood beside him since their first raids, watched the preparations with calculating eyes. Warriors who had grown rich and comfortable under Ragnar's rule weighed their loyalties against their ambitions. The curse that the seer had prophesied so long ago wound tighter with each passing day, waiting for its moment to strike. The fleet that sailed west numbered over 200 ships carrying the flower of Norse military might. Ragnar stood at the prow of his flagship, the same vessel that had carried him to his first English victory, but where once he had sailed with careful purpose. Now he drove his fleet with reckless haste, pushing through storms that would have given his younger self pause for thought. Nature itself seemed to rise against them. Waves tall as fortress walls swept warriors from their ships while winds howled with fury that felt personally targeted. Ravens wheeled overhead in numbers that blotted out the sun, their cries a chorus of doom that even the most hardened warriors could not ignore. When they finally limped into English waters, less than a third of their original force remained. Exhausted warriors found themselves facing an enemy that had learned all too well from years of Norse raids. King Ella's forces had prepared the battlefield with cruel precision, turning Ragnar's own innovative tactics against him. The battle that followed was less a contest than a slaughter. Cavalry charged from concealed positions, while archers rained death from the cliff tops. Everything that had once made Ragnar's tactics revolutionary was turned against his forces with brutal efficiency. Yet even as his army died around him, Ragnar fought with the same cold precision that had made him legend. His axes sang their deadly song as he carved a path through English warriors, each movement an expression of the skill that had transformed him from farmer to king. Even his enemies paused to watch his deadly dance, knowing they witnessed the last stand of a legend. It was treachery rather than combat that finally brought him down. A thrown spear took him in the leg, not from the front where he fought, but from behind where trusted warriors should have guarded his back. He turned to see Rollo, his own brother, lowering the spear that had cast the blow. "The gods demand balance," Rollo said simply, his voice carrying over the sounds of battle. "You rose too high, brother. Forgot too much. Someone had to remind you what it means to be mortal." Understanding and fury warred in Ragnar's eyes as English warriors surrounded him. Even then he fought, taking 3 more men with him before a mace blow finally sent him into darkness. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was the sky above, black with ravens that seemed to laugh at his fall. The curse that had driven him to greatness had finally collected its price, delivered through the betrayal that the seer had promised so long ago. The legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, who had risen from farmer to king through blood and cunning, who had transformed the Norse world through ambition and innovation, who had built an empire that spanned the western seas, lay defeated on English soil. But even as his warriors died or fled, even as chains were clasped around his wrists, something of the old wolf's smile played across his bloodied face. For he knew, with the same certainty that had guided his rise to power, that this was not the end of his saga. It was merely the beginning of its most memorable chapter. Terror wore iron chains in the dungeons beneath York's Great Hall, though not in the way King Ella had intended. The English guards spoke in whispers, crossing themselves whenever they passed the cell that held Ragnar Lothbrok. Despite his bonds, despite his wounds, despite his utter powerlessness, the captured Norse king radiated a presence that turned his prison into a throne room and his guards into an unwilling audience. He sat in perfect stillness against the rough stone wall. Chains pooled around him like sleeping serpents. Blood had dried in his beard and matted his hair, yet somehow he appeared more regal than the English nobles who came to gawk at their captured nightmare. His eyes, cold and calculating as ever, studied each visitor with the same predatory interest he had once given to settlements ripe for raiding. "They say he hasn't slept," one guard whispered to another during a shift change. 3 days now, just sitting there smiling that demon's smile. The priest came to offer him salvation, fled after one look in those eyes. "Witchcraft," his companion muttered, clutching the cross at his neck. "No mortal man should smile so much in chains." Indeed, Ragnar's smile had become the talk of the fortress. It was not the desperate grin of a doomed man, nor the forced bravado of one facing death. It was the same wolf smile he had worn when planning raids, when outmaneuvering earls, when building his legend one calculated step at a time. It was the smile of a man who knew something his captors did not. King Ella himself came on the 4th day, accompanied by a retinue of armed guards and nervous priests. The English king had aged well in the decade since Ragnar had forced him to kneel in submission, though new lines around his eyes spoke of years spent nursing hatred and plotting revenge. "The great Ragnar Lothbrok," Ella's voice dripped contempt as he studied his chained enemy. "Scourge of England, self-proclaimed king of the Norse, legend in his own mind. Look how far you've fallen." Ragnar's laugh was genuine, carrying the same fierce joy it had held in victory. "Fallen? I've risen higher than any man in history, built an empire that will outlast both of us. What does it matter if I fall now? My legend is already written." "Is it?" Ella moved closer, though his guards shifted nervously at his approach. "I wonder what the skalds will sing about your end, about how the mighty Ragnar Lothbrok was betrayed by his own brother, captured by men he once mocked, brought low by his own pride." "They'll sing whatever I choose," Ragnar replied with terrifying certainty. "For I will write the final verses myself, with your blood and England's terror as my ink." His smile widened, showing teeth stained with his own blood. "My sons will come for you, Ella. They'll come with fire and steel, with vengeance in their hearts, and my legend burning in their souls." "Your sons?" Now it was Ella's turn to laugh, though there was an edge of unease beneath the mockery. "Do you think I fear boys playing at their father's game? England is stronger now thanks to the lessons you taught us. We've learned from every raid, adapted to every tactic. Your time is over, Northman. Your empire dies with you." Ragnar leaned forward, chains clinking with the movement, and even the battle-hardened English king took an involuntary step back. "You understand nothing of what I've built, what I've sacrificed, what powers I've bound with blood and pain. This—" he rattled his chains with deliberate contempt. "This is not my defeat, Ella. This is my final victory, my masterpiece, the greatest gift I could give my sons." "What nonsense is this? Think, little king. What better way to unite the Norse than to give them a martyred legend? What better cause than vengeance for a fallen hero? What better gift could a father leave his sons than a debt of blood that can only be paid in English suffering?" His laugh echoed off the dungeon walls like ravens calling. "You don't kill a legend by killing a man. You only feed it, give it wings, send it soaring into saga and song." The truth of his words seemed to hit Ella like a physical blow. He studied his prisoner with new understanding and growing dread. "You planned this," he whispered. "Somehow, some way, you planned even this." "Perhaps?" Ragnar's smile was enigmatic now. "Or perhaps the gods themselves wrote this saga, and I simply played my part with style. Either way, the ending will be the same. Fire and blood and vengeance on a scale that will echo through generations." Hours passed in that dungeon as king faced king, each trying to break the other's will through words sharper than swords. Ella brought priests to offer salvation, torturers to offer pain, nobles to offer mockery. Through it all, Ragnar sat in regal stillness, his presence filling the underground chamber, until his very chains seemed more like ornaments than restraints. When torture finally came, Ragnar's screams transformed into laughter that chilled hardened warriors to their souls. When mockery came, his replies left noble tongues tied and proud men fleeing in confusion. When threats came, his promises of vengeance carried such certainty that even Ella's most loyal thanes began casting worried glances at their king. Finally, as darkness gathered on the 7th day of his captivity, Ella made his decision. Guards entered Ragnar's cell with extended spears, though their hands shook as they approached the chained legend. "Take him to the pit," Ella commanded from the safety of the doorway. "Let us see if the great Ragnar Lothbrok's pride survives the embrace of serpents." They expected resistance, perhaps even feared it despite their prisoner's chains. Instead, Ragnar rose with fluid grace that made his bonds seem meaningless. His smile, if anything, grew wider as they led him through torchlit corridors toward his doom. As they emerged into the courtyard where the snake pit waited, a sound filled the air that made every English heart skip a beat. Ravens, hundreds of them, thousands, had gathered on every wall and rooftop. Their harsh cries echoed off the stones like a chorus of the damned, while their wings painted the torchlight into strange shadows that seemed to dance with awful purpose. Ragnar Lothbrok walked toward his death with the same measured stride that had carried him from farmer's field to legendary throne. His chains rang against the stones with rhythmic precision, like a smith's hammer forging destiny itself. And his smile, that terrible wolf smile that had haunted English dreams for a generation, never wavered. Guards and nobles alike drew back from his passage, crossing themselves and muttering prayers. For in that moment, they saw not a defeated enemy, but something ancient and terrible, a legend taking its final, most powerful form. The pit waited ahead, ancient stones worn smooth by generations of victims, darkness gathering in its depths like pooled shadow. Yet even as they led him to its edge, Ragnar Lothbrok's presence filled the courtyard like a physical force, turning his death march into a triumph. For he knew with the same certainty that had guided his rise from farmer to king, that this was not his end. It was his final gift to his sons, his last lesson in the art of legend crafting, his ultimate victory disguised as defeat. The ravens called overhead, their voices a chorus of doom and destiny, and Ragnar Lothbrok smiled his wolf's smile, ready to write the final verses of his saga in venom and glory. Destiny wore serpent scales on the morning Ragnar Lothbrok transformed from king to legend. The ancient stones of the snake pit rose around him like the jaws of some forgotten beast, while above, ravens gathered in numbers that turned dawn's light to dusk. Their wings painted shadows across the faces of the assembled crowd. English nobles come to witness a legend's death, Norse prisoners brought to watch their king's final moments. The pit itself was older than memory, its stones worn smooth by generations of victims, yet never had it held prey quite like this. Ragnar stood at its edge, chains still wrapped around his limbs like sleeping serpents, his presence somehow filling the entire courtyard despite his bonds. Blood matted his hair and stained his beard, but his eyes burned with the same cold fire that had first driven him from farmer's fields to legendary throne. King Ella watched from a safe distance, surrounded by nervous guards who clutched crosses and spears with equal fervor. The English king's face betrayed a curious mixture of triumph and unease as he studied his chained enemy. "Any final words, great Ragnar?" Ella called out, his voice carrying forced mockery. "Perhaps a prayer to your heathen gods?" Ragnar's laugh was genuine, carrying the same fierce joy it had held in victory. His voice, when it came, carried clearly to every ear in the hushed courtyard. "Gods! I need no gods to make my name echo through eternity. My sons will write my saga in English blood." His smile was terrible to behold. How the little pigs will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. The words hung in the air like sword smoke as guards moved to position him for the final descent. Yet before they could touch him, Ragnar moved with fluid grace that made his chains seem meaningless. He stepped to the pit's edge under his own power, his bearing more suited to a throne room than an execution. "Remember this moment," he commanded the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "Remember how you stood and watched greatness embrace death. Remember my smile when my sons come to claim their vengeance." His laugh echoed off the ancient stones. "For I do not die here. I merely shed this mortal form like a snake sheds its skin. What emerges will be something far more terrible." Even the guards drew back from the power in his voice, leaving him alone at the pit's edge. Below, shadows stirred as serpents sensed their prey's approach. Their scales caught torchlight like wet steel, while their tongues tasted the air, eager for royal blood. Ragnar Lothbrok faced his death as he had faced every challenge, with calculated purpose and theatrical flair. He threw back his head and called out in a voice that seemed to shake the very stones, "Odin, look upon your son. Look upon how I die, and know that I have earned my place in your hall. Let my death be worthy of saga. Let my vengeance shake the very foundations of England. Let my name echo through eternity." Then, before any could touch him, he stepped forward into darkness. Chains rang against ancient stone as he descended, the sound somehow transforming from prisoner's lament to warrior's song. Those who watched would later swear that he never stopped smiling, never showed a moment's fear, as serpents rose to meet him. What followed would be spoken of in whispers for generations. They said Ragnar Lothbrok faced death as he had faced life, with iron will and wolfish hunger. They said he laughed as serpents struck, turned their venom into strength through sheer force of will. They said his voice grew stronger with each bite, his promises of vengeance more terrible with each drop of poison that entered his veins. His final words rose from the pit like thunder, a curse and a promise that would echo through history. "My sons will avenge me. They will come with fire and steel, with hatred in their hearts, and my legend burning in their souls. Every drop of my blood will be paid for in oceans of English tears. I do not end here, I begin." Then at last, silence fell. The greatest king in Norse history, the man who had transformed himself from farmer to legend through blood and cunning, embraced his prophesied doom with the same theatrical genius that had marked his entire life. But even as his body grew still, something else was born in that ancient pit, something that transcended mere flesh and bone, something that would shake kingdoms and reshape the very nature of power in the northern world. The ravens lifted as one from the fortress walls, their wings darkening the sky as they carried news of Ragnar's death to the four corners of the world. Their harsh cries seemed to carry meaning, seemed to speak of doom and destiny, of vengeance and glory yet to come. In Kattegat, Bjorn Ironside stood at his father's high seat when the ravens brought their message. The warrior who had once been a farmer's son felt something shift in the world's fabric, felt power and purpose settle around his shoulders like a cloak of lead. "So it begins," he said softly, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. Around him, his brothers gathered, Ubbi, Vitsirk, Sigurd, and Ivar the Boneless. Each felt the weight of their father's death. Each understood that this was not an ending but a beginning. "He knew," Ivar observed, his eyes fever-bright with understanding. "He knew this would unite us, knew his death would give us purpose beyond mere ambition." The youngest son's laugh was sharp with appreciation. Even in dying, he played the game better than anyone. "Not a game," Bjorn corrected him. "A saga, the greatest saga ever written, and we are its next chapter." He raised his voice to address the warriors gathering in the hall. "My father's blood calls out for vengeance. Who will help us answer?" The roar that followed shook the timbers of Kattegat's great hall. Warriors who had grown fat and comfortable under Ragnar's rule found their hunger for glory rekindled. Young men who had grown up hearing tales of the farmer-turned-king felt destiny calling them to write their own legends. The curse that the seer had prophesied so long ago had run its course through Ragnar's life. Yet instead of destroying his legacy, it had transformed it into something eternal. His death would inspire generations of warriors, reshape the very nature of power in the northern world, and write his name in letters of blood across the pages of history. For in dying as he had lived, proud and fierce and utterly convinced of his own legend, Ragnar Lothbrok had achieved exactly what he had always wanted. He had transformed himself from mere king to eternal symbol, from ruler to religion, from man to myth. The ravens circled one final time over York's ancient stones, their voices a chorus of triumph and doom. Below them, in a pit that would become as legendary as the man it had claimed, serpents coiled around the mortal remains of greatness. But Ragnar Lothbrok's spirit had already taken wing, had already begun its transformation into something that would outlast stones and snakes and kingdoms. For legends, once properly born, can never truly die. They merely sleep in the hearts of those they inspire, waiting to rise again when destiny calls. And in the gathering dark, as warriors sharpened swords and sons plotted vengeance, destiny called with a voice that sounded suspiciously like ravens laughing. The farmer was long dead, The earl was forgotten, the king had fallen. But the legend was immortal. And somewhere in the shadows between worlds, the gods themselves wondered who had truly won in the end, they who had cursed a man with greatness, or he who had transformed their curse into eternal glory. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok was ended. The saga of his vengeance was about to begin. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe.